It's a blessing to be here with you today. What I'm going to share this afternoon is a part of what I shared at the Weimar Institute in California in February. And this was kind of unique to the group because they had never had a lecture on hydrotherapy at their seminars before. They had a lot of help with mental health, and we're seeing an increase of mental problems. The fear, the worry, the grief, the anxiety has led to more people on drugs, mental health drugs, more alcohol use, and more suffering in the mind as well as the body. And so what I'm sharing with you is something that's been given unique to Seventh-day Adventists to give to the world, not only with our hands, but with our knowledge and our hearts. And I think you'll find this very interesting. Some of it's history, and some of it is application. It started, of course, in the beginning when God said, "Let there be firmament in the midst of the waters." Where's that in the Bible? Genesis. That's good. You're good Bible students here. That's a simple question. I'm going to get to some hard ones coming up here. And let it divide the waters from the waters. So there's water above, water below. When I came in yesterday, there was these puffy white clouds out there, and the big airplane was rocking like this. And I looked around. I couldn't see anything in the sky. There was nothing to hit. No, but there was bumps in the air, bumps in the clear air, not just in the clouds. And it's very interesting indeed, especially in a smaller plane. But God put this firmament to divide the waters from the waters in the ground and the waters in the sky. And He made this for us, didn't He? To grow the grass and grow the food, grow the trees, and grow the people. So when we use this therapeutically in health, we call it hydrotherapy, or a more modern term is hydrothermal therapy, which has to do with temperature, hot, cold, for example, whereas water without that would be just hydro. So what I'm going to share with you is some of the new features, but also some of the history. And to understand the future, we need to know about the past. The history of hydrotherapy is very interesting, and we'll look at some of the techniques that are used, and then something brand new, and that is something new to me, actually, in the last few months, and that is heat shock proteins and their chaperones. Have you heard of that before? And this is very exciting information that has to do with a study of biochemistry and how it works in our body to make our hot bath or hot shower or hot fomentation powerful to kill virus particles. And we didn't know this before. It's new information just in the last few years. Let's look at history first of all. Personal hygiene goes back to ancient Egyptian culture and the Hebrews. And the Egyptians, as a social class, were expected to bathe, as are Americans today. You wouldn't stay in a motel if it had no bathtub or shower, would you? If it had just a garden hose outside and you could go out there and turn it on and stand under it. And I had a lady working for me who lived in a kind of a commune. She wanted to go natural, and their shower was outdoors with a little place for privacy that they would walk around cement block enclosure, and they would turn the faucet on, and it was cold water coming out. But she bathed every day, and I was thankful for that, of course, because she was our receptionist, and you wouldn't want to be met with the opposite. So God gave the Egyptians a river called the Nile, and the Nile River is beautiful. I've been there. I flew over and landed in Egypt some years ago and went to the Cairo Museum, and to the pyramids and got to see some of these actual things at a time when Americans were on an advisory not to go to Egypt because a bus had been sabotaged and exploded with a bomb, and so they were not having any Americans go there. And I still remember getting on this 747, and there were 30 passengers aboard. And they put me right next to somebody. So I was sitting with a seatmate, and he spoke to me, and because he spoke English. He was originally from Sudan, but he lived in Canada. He said, "I saw you in the airport reading your Bible this morning." He said, "I too am a Christian." I thought, here's a 747 that can hold 300 and some people, and there's two of us sitting next to each other in the seat. We split up later because we were going to London and we needed a nap, but he wanted to talk to me about the Bible. God has ways and means of putting us in contact. I said, "Well, I read something every morning." He said, "I haven't read the Bible in years." He was a Coptic Christian, which goes back to the original Christian faith in northern Africa, and he hadn't read his Bible, and I was able to point him back to the source of light. So these were bathing and cleanliness, and you remember, of course, it was the Pharaoh's daughter that went to the Nile River to bathe when she found baby Moses there. So that was the beginning of this as far as the Bible story. Ancient Greeks and Romans had bathhouses known as thermae, because some of them were hot and some of them were cold. Thermae, the ancient hydrotherapy. And Hippocrates hypothesized that all human beings started as a result of imbalanced fluids, and thus recommended hydrotherapy to balance the fluids. Ellen White talks about balancing the circulation. And so this goes back a long ways too. And they heated water in something that they called back then hypocausts. That was an underground furnace that heated the water. There's a bath at Kurion, which was constructed in the 4th century AD, and that was ancient bath house. If you just see water in there where the floor has fallen out, I suppose. And then the Chinese and Japanese, they've had bathing cultures too, different practices. And Buddhism connects bathing with purification. Hydrotherapy in ancient Japan was more about hygiene. And when I went to Korea a number of years ago, they said, "You've got to try this special bath that they had." And it was kind of like getting in a 55-gallon drum filled with hot water. And you get in there and squat down until the water's right up to your neck, and it was as hot as you can stand. Only the families used this bath, and the father first, and then the mother, and then the children according to their ages, as the water tended to cool off, I suppose, but they all used the same water, and they had to do a sponge bath first. So they cleaned themselves up first before they took this bath. So I had a chance to experience that and see what was, but I didn't want to go in after mother and father and all the stair step of babies did, so I got one for myself. That was just fine. Then we come to the Bible, the Pool of Siloam, and a freshwater reservoir, not salt water, fresh water, and it was a gathering place for the city. And you remember what it says in John chapter 6, John chapter 9, when Jesus found himself there. It says, "When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way therefore and washed and came seeing." that man was born blind, congenital blindness. Or possible like Helen Keller, rather than Fanny Crosby, who became blind in infancy by a doctor that put a mustard plaster on her eyes for eye inflammation and burned her eyes so bad that she never could see. And she wrote thousands of songs, and we've got more by her in our hymn book than almost any other hymn writer, except maybe Charles Wesley and Isaac Watts. But those three lead the singers. So this was also historical, but also a miracle of healing. Then in Europe, they had indoor plumbing, which was a novel invention in the Victorian era that had them get hydrotherapy in their own homes. And these clawfoot tubs are something that you'd find in old homes today, or ones that are made to look old. Hydrotherapy has been used in mental health, and often it conjures images of just Hollywood stars soaking in a rich scented water tub and making themselves more beautiful and attractive. But it was a psychiatric modality as well. And it wasn't just a dip in the water. They used hot water and cold water for specific mental health conditions. Some doctors got a little too zealous about this, prescribing therapies that sounded more like punishment than panacea. One treatment involved mummifying the patient in towels soaked in ice-cold water. Any volunteers? No. And another required the patient to remain continuously submerged in a bath for hours or even days. And I've got pictures of the types of tubs they used, where they would leave them in the water for days, getting out only to use the bathroom. They would even eat in the tub. I've got a picture for you of this. And when I was in medical training, in the 1960s, Patton State Hospital in California was still using hydrotherapy for mental health and some of these various things. Then came along Benjamin Rush. You've read about him in American history because he's one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he was a physician, political leader, member of Continental Congress, and he developed the best book on mental health that was called Medical Inquiries and Observations Upon the Diseases of the Mind, published in 1812. That book was one of the first and for many years the only American book on psychiatry. And he believed in hydrotherapy. And I'll show you what he did, but he also believed in bloodletting and purging and some things that we think are very unwise to use today. Here are some of the tubs that were used to treat patients that were mentally unstable. They were put in very hot water or very cold water, which I don't recommend for either of you, unless you're the kind of person like my granddaughter who had her 15th birthday, and the night before her birthday, this was in December last year, she decided to go swimming in the lake in Maine. It had had a skim of ice, and then the ice had been melted off by some rain, and so she plunged in at night and went swimming. She couldn't get any of her family members, even her siblings, to go with her, so she had to go by herself. But there were some people on standby in case she got in trouble, but she didn't have a heart attack because she's only 15. And so these temperatures could be adjusted, and depending on the mental situation of the patient. This is a use of a prolonged sedative bath to treat people in mental hospitals. And they've got coverings to keep the water from changing temperature rapidly. And just the head is out. And can you imagine being in the tub for days at a time? Then they had the cold contrast. Do you see what the man on the right has in his hand a fire hose. And that's cold, ice cold water. And the patient who's just gotten out of the bath goes up here and stands and holds on to something for dear life, kind of like biting on a bullet, you might say. And he's getting it in the back, up and down his spine with ice cold water. And this kind of contrast between hot and cold has been used, although when it's involuntary, it's a little more like torture. Then there's competition to these types of rational hydrotherapy, and I'm going to go briefly through some of the things that have come up in medical history in the last 150 years, several of which Ellen White wrote about in cautioning people or addressing the subject. And these are the ones, we'll just go through them. There's the Transorbital Lobotomy. Have you heard of frontal lobotomy? That was in the 1900s, in the 1930s and 1940s. And they would have the patient lie down, and that's before lidocaine that they used like for dental surgery and numbing procedures. They'd maybe hold an ice cube against the area and then hammer this probe into the brain through right beside the eyeball. Not through the eye, but right beside the eyeball. And it would go up into the frontal lobes, which are here, and then they'd take the, if this is the face, they'd go around like this and sever the nerves in the frontal lobe. And that's called a frontal lobotomy. It was used for schizophrenia, for depression and different diseases. And the doctor that went around from town to town doing this procedure, they called his vehicle the lobotomy mobile. Kind of like the Pope mobile. And I'd rather have the Pope visit me than this guy, I think. But they went around in a circle like this, pivoting right here. And there's an actual patient getting the treatment and this little probe in the brain. This is before antibiotics even. Can you imagine? You're going to run the risk of meningitis and brain abscess as well. Well, here is some pictures that you can see of a patient before and after. A schizophrenic 8-year-old boy that was just spaced out and uncommunicative, and now he's got a more normal facial expression. Or a lady that looked like she's 49 years old, but she looks like she's about 100, and afterwards. So you can see why, when they got one or two successes, why it tended to take off. Now, I wouldn't recommend this to you, no matter how depressed you are, how twisted in your thinking, and we don't do this for false doctrines or for other kinds of things, but there are some positive cases, but it fell into disrepute because of people dying from infections, and some were made worse, as you might guess. You knock out the frontal lobes, and you've eliminated part of the personality. So the person becomes more of a zombie. They're calm and peaceful, but they're not making any contribution to society. Then there's rotational therapy. This was a relative of Darwin. Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a physician, a philosopher and scientist, but he wasn't any good at any of those three, according to the historians. His ideas weren't taken very seriously, and he believed in rotational therapy, where you'd put somebody on a chair and spin them around and around and around and around and around for an hour or two. The only problem was Dr. Benjamin Rush adopted that therapy too for a while. And the only thing that they accomplished for their patients was they got dizzy. You probably did that in years gone by, spin around, or maybe you were an ice skater and you see how they spin. But the Rush ended up with dizzy patients, But these years, they used the rotational therapy to condition astronauts for getting out in weightless environments, because the capsule may go into a spin and they want to make sure they can handle that. So it's not used in physical medicine or mental health anymore. Then there's trepanation. Have you heard of that? The trepanation was more of an ancient idea, even goes back to Egypt, where they would drill holes in the skull, and it was based on the idea that there's some demons in there that need to escape. And you've got to make a hole in the skull so the demons can escape out. Now, I don't know if they would want to or not. They might have enjoyed the home they had. But they would make holes in the skull, and they found skulls when they dug up the bones of people who have passed away. And they phased that practice out, even though there's still an international trepanation advisory group. That's still a support group for that practice today, and but not done in medicine or psychiatry. Here's a picture of the skull that has had trepanation, and the reason they can tell it is because it's such a uniform circle, or it looks like you take and cut a circle by drilling with a cordless drill, 20 or 30 holes, and then the center part can be popped out. So and so you can find skulls in not only in Egypt but in modern times. This is the toolbox for the trepanation. Didn't take too many tools, and again, that is kind of like we read about George Washington getting bloodletting, and he got the state-of-the-art treatment. This was considered state-of-the-art many years ago. Then there's insulin coma therapy. It was discovered by a Dr. Manfred Sackel, who accidentally gave one of his diabetic patients an insulin overdose, and it sent her into a coma. And what was a mistake turned into a triumph, because she was a drug addict and she woke up not craving any morphine ever again. So she was cured. And Sackel, who really isn't earning our trust, decided to make the same mistake with another patient who woke up claiming to be cured. And before long, he was intentionally doing it on other patients, reporting a 90% recovery rate, particularly among schizophrenic patients. And strangely, however, his treatment successes are a mystery, because normally people go into a coma and some are going to die. And if the treatment is worse than the disease, we should not do it. Right. Have you heard that lately? That the treatment could be worse than the disease? We had a president whose name sounds like Triumph, only it's abbreviated and it's called Trump, who said the treatment can't be worse than the disease. And if you give a shot to somebody and a significant percentage of them are dying, you should do what with that treatment? Stop it, discard it. And that's happening today. This big dose of insulin caused the blood sugars to drop. Normally that's 100 to 80. If it drops to 50, you feel shaky and intensely hungry. If it drops to 20, you go into a coma. And if it drops to 15, you might not wake up from the coma. So they had enough patients die, about 1 to 2% of them, which is even worse than the current vaccine, which is like 1 in 10,000, So this was a bad idea. And then there was one, and Ellen White writes considerable about this, called mesmerism. In fact, they accused Ellen Harmon of being mesmerized when she was having her visions. Do you remember that? They accused her of that. And so this was popular in the early 1800s, and they thought an invisible force pervaded everything in existence, and disruptions in this force caused pain and suffering. But they also attributed to the gravity of the moon that affected body fluids and related to ocean tides. Now, that dilemma was solved by Dr. Mesmer, who used magnets. Do you remember reading in Ellen White's writings, like early writings, about magnetism? And there are people today that want to put magnets in their shoes. Now they're putting even magnets on the arms of people that have been vaccinated, and they stick. Well, there's something going on here that we better find out about, because this is a resurgence of the ancient magnetism idea, and it may not be all physiology. So many of these people thought this was a miracle cure, and mesmerism morphed into hypnotism. And today we have hypnotism. You can go in the phone book in the yellow pages, and you can find hypnotists that can treat you if you're not too cautious. So Mesmer is considered the father of modern hypnosis, because he discovered the power of suggestion, and that's what we mean by being mesmerized. Then there's chemical induction of seizures. I read about this when I was in medical school, though I've never seen any person that had this done. And this was a Hungarian pathologist named von Meduna that pioneered the idea. And again, they're looking at schizophrenia. They found it rare in epileptics, so they thought, well, let's give them seizures, and maybe they can overcome this mental disease. And so they used drugs like strychnine. Ellen White wrote about strychnine. And here's a more familiar one called caffeine. And then absinthe. And do you know what the modern word for absinthe is? It's wormwood. Wormwood. And you can go down to even the health food store and you can buy wormwood. Absinthe is a hallucinogenic drug that is often mixed with alcohol. In France, they had pubs that were special places where you would take brandy or some alcoholic beverage and put absinthe with it, and they would get a double dose. And Picasso was very famous for going to these places, and you know what his paintings look like. Most of those paintings of Picasso, who's considered a great artist, were painted under the influence of a mind-altering substance called absinthe. The Russians have an interesting word for wormwood. The Russian word is Chernobyl. And you've heard of Chernobyl too, haven't you? Very, very interesting history of these various treatments. So the side effects of massive seizures were broken bones. They convulse so vigorously that they break their arms or their legs, and so that again has fallen out of use, plus memory loss. And if you have a treatment, whether it's a drug treatment or an electric shock treatment or a chemical treatment, and then afterwards you can't remember, there's somebody at least that doesn't want you to do it again. Maybe your family members. We don't like to lose our memories. And then there's one called phrenology. Around the turn of the 19th century, the German physician Franz Gall developed phrenology, where they had bumps on the head and they drew a map on the head like this one on the left, where there were various emotions and moods and thought processes and diseases tied to the various bumps. And if you feel your skull, except some of you who have such a beautifully round-shaped skull that you can shave your head and it just looks pristine, the skull is not perfectly round. There was one famous phrenologist in the 1800s who said that Ellen White was, William Miller was a fanatical, and he must have had a big fanatical lump on his skull. And so William Miller, who was a farmer, but a real Bible student, he said, well, why don't you take me to this man? And so they did, and he examined his skull. Now this is the William Miller as he was teaching controversial end-time events of the coming of Jesus. And the phrenologist felt his skull, and he says, my, sir, you have the most noble skull. You are just, you must be really intelligent. And he went on and on about this. And then he said, oh, by the way, I forgot to ask you your name. What is your name? And he said, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, yes, I need to know your name. He says, my name's Miller. Oh, Miller, what's your first name? William. And then he realized who he had been examining, and he ran out of the room and ran out of the house, totally embarrassed, and never made any more public proclamations in the newspaper about William Miller. That was an interesting story in Adventist history. But that was phrenology. And then there was Hysteria Therapy. You might say that sounds like funny, but the idea was that the uterus is wandering around inside the woman, and we've got to find its home again. And that's why when she got pregnant, at least the uterus was back where it belonged. And so they tried to do various manipulations to get the uterus to go back where it would be and calm it down. So there was no end of methods, including holding foul-smelling things under the person's nose or to drive the uterus out of the chest. You know, there's nothing like anatomy to help you understand the body and what the diseases are. Now I'm coming back to the hydrotherapy. These are all the things coming up when our Adventist movement and our sanitariums were developing that could get us off the track this way or the other way. Here's how they put people in water baths in a tub, and they would put towels or sheets over and really kind of isolate them in there in the hot water, put a cold cloth and change it frequently on the forehead, and they would be in there for a long time. And if it was neutral baths or lukewarm baths, it would be sedative. You'd almost fall asleep in there. If it was real hot, it would be very uncomfortable, and you'd get hyperthermia or a fever. And if it was cold, you'd be shivering. But eventually, your body temperature would equalize. But it was very hard on the system. But this was commonly used. And then there was the douche baths. Douche means to pour. And so this doesn't look like a voluntary treatment to me. It looks like they caught somebody that was mentally ill and stripped them off and laid them down, and this is almost like waterboarding, isn't it? And here's a guy standing up on a chair pouring water, ice water, right in the person's face. And I think I would try to cooperate not to have the second treatment. But that was in Pennsylvania. This is in America. And here was hydrotherapy in a mental hospital. Does that look like a pleasant place to go and take your treatments? It just looks like it's been bombed out from the war, but that's the way it looked. And here's another cold pour. They used cedar slats and made tubs with that, and patients get in there, and then but I think that guy is sneaking up on the backside of a thing, and the person inside doesn't know what's coming. But here's one in cold pour from a therapist in a sanitarium. After a hot bath, the cold. Have you ever done a hot shower and then cold, or hot bath and cold? If you get up a little more courage, it's good for you. It raises your white blood count and helps your immune system to get stronger. This they called hydrocrucifixion because they strapped the person like this, and then they turned that fire hose on them. And so these have been in hospitals all over the country in a past generation. And here's one, a dunking therapy, where the person is up on a platform, and now you see him, and then you don't. He goes, drops it down in the water. Sounds like something you might do at a 4th of July picnic, but this is therapy for having evil spirits and trying to get it out of people. And this is, of course, not a real hydrotherapy, but that's the tsunami wave that's just about to give people a saltwater bath. That's a very dangerous form. Now, let's go to the 18th and 19th centuries. English physicians began to popularize the use of hydrotherapy and publishing about it, and various types used in what was now called a sanitarium, where they were treating mental illness, alcoholism, and other health conditions. And today it's popular still, supported by modern science. And here is one of the uses of hydrotherapy called the wet sheet pack. They wrap a wet sheet, usually cold, around a person, up to their neck, wrap a blanket around them on top of that, and you're kind of mummified, and you go through phases. First of all, shiver a little bit, then your body gets warm, then you get real warm, and then you fall asleep in there. There's nothing else to do. You might as well take a nap. But have any of you ever had a wet sheet bath? In my book on hydrotherapy, I describe that because we use it for children, for fevers, and it's a very good home remedy. But here's it's done in one of the sanitariums. I think this might even have been at Battle Creek. And there's another type of bath where they're sitting in a deeper bathtub, and this was an article from Life magazine years ago that showed hydrotherapy in use. And here's lunch in the tub. You see, they didn't miss a meal. They'd bring it to them right there and let their arms come out, and they can eat. And then when they get out, only when they need to use the toilet. So this was how they served them. This is a different kind of hydrotherapy called a light box. And there were light bulbs in the side. It took Thomas Edison to come up with electricity and the light bulb, and they would have a thermostat for the temperature, and you would start sweating. Dr. Thrash had a light box in her treatment facility for years. At Wildwood, we had a different kind called the Russian steam bath, which was also a steaming treatment. But this was the light box. And you can see the difference. Here at Battle Creek, it was clean, hygienic, spotless. And that isn't just for a photograph. That's the way they treated, because there's a patient in this one getting a treatment. There's another group lined up, and you could naturally treat a lot of people at the same time. This is called a Turkish bath, where you sit up, and I have one at my office, which is fiberglass, where you sit inside and it steams, and we use it to fight viruses, and including shingles and flu, and it raises the body temperature a little bit, and I'll show you the physiology of how that works. Here's another type of treatment, a little older, and then a modern one. I kind of like this idea out there where the lights and outside on the porch, like the modern hot tub. And here's a real super tub. Anyone have like that in your home? I think that would cost more than $1,000, maybe 5 or 10. It's got every bell and whistle that you could imagine. But that's a modern tub that you can purchase and set in place for therapy. Now, what does Ellen White say about this? In health and sickness, pure water is one of heaven's choicest blessings, its proper use promotes health. It is the beverage which God provided to quench the thirst of animals and man. Drunk freely, it helps to supply the necessities of the system and assists nature to resist disease. Then she goes to what we call hydrotherapy. The external application of water is one of the easiest and most satisfactory ways of regulating the circulation of the blood. A cold or cool bath is an excellent tonic. What do we mean by tonic? Give you energy. Perk you up. Warm baths open the pores and thus aid in the elimination of impurities. In your hand, on 1 square centimeter, you have 3,000 pores. That's why your hands sweat when you are nervous, or if you're in an airplane and it starts to bounce around and you just feel your hands, they're sweaty. And 3,000 little pores on 1 square centimeter of your hand, which is about like your fingertip. And so they open the pores, and that's nature's second kidney, because you're actually eliminating impurities. And both warm and neutral baths, she says, soothe the nerves and equalize the circulation. That's probably what we like the best, is warm and neutral baths. And so that's the message God has given to his people. And why isn't it used more? The answer is many have never learned by experience the beneficial effects of the proper use of water, and they are afraid of it. Somebody called me on the phone from the East Coast and said, my wife has come down with COVID. What can I do? And they were talking about ivermectin, which is worm medicine for horses and cats, or hydroxychloroquine, which is malaria drug. And they said, we've tried the vitamin D, and we've tried the vitamin C, and we've been using some herbs. I said, have you given your wife hydrotherapy? No, we hadn't thought of that, but we've heard of it. So I described some treatments they could do in their home, and she got well quickly. And so Sister White says, water treatments are not as appreciated as they should be, and to apply them skillfully requires work that many are unwilling to perform. That's why it's out of the hospitals. It requires work. Is it faster to just give a shot? Or to give a pill? Or to give a 45-minute treatment that takes a therapist with the person? So that's one of the reasons it's fallen out of use. But here's the inspired counsel. None should feel excused for ignorance or indifference on this subject. There are many ways in which water can be applied to relieve pain and check disease. She says all should become intelligent in its use in simple home treatments. So my question is, are you intelligent in the use of hydrotherapy in simple home treatments? If not, apprentice yourself to somebody or take a seminar or learn how to do this. This is very important. So now we're going to leap into a more modern use for hydrotherapy. This is the history of Adventist treatments. James Caleb Jackson was an inventor of the first dry whole grain breakfast cereal, which he called granola. Can you see where that name came to Kellogg and turned into granola? This was granola. He made that cereal at his place, and Ellen White took her husband, James White, there for treatment when he had a breakdown. He'd had a stroke, a nervous breakdown. He wasn't able to function anymore, and in 1860s, she took her husband there to our home hygienic institute at Dansville, New York. I visited this place. It's a great big building. And under Jackson's management, the spa grew to become one of the largest in the world, catering to around 20,000 patients when it was called Our Home on the Hillside. And this is where Ellen White and James White went in the early days of our movement to get help for his condition. The only thing was that Dr. Jackson believed people should loosen up and have a little more fun, and he recommended dancing. So he had dances, and he recommended card playing and things that Ellen White was shown in vision God's people shouldn't be doing. So she took her husband out of the place, and went up to friends in Rochester, New York. And on December 25, 1865, she had a vision. I call it the Christmas vision. And she was shown that we should have our own sanitariums where people can get treated. And that's how Battle Creek was formed, as a result of that vision. And Dr. Kellogg, who the White family put through medical school, he lived in their home as a teenager. They helped him through medical school, and he formed the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was no small project. A magnificent facility, the original sanitarium. That's the one that burned in 1904. And Kellogg became their medical director as a young man. And I looked when I was in school at Loma Linda, I looked in the dictionary, what is a sanitarium? And here's the dictionary definition. An institution for the promotion of health. The word was originally coined to designate the institution established by the Seventh-day Adventists at Battle Creek to distinguish it from institutions providing care for mental or tuberculous patients. I looked at that in the dictionary, Dorland's Medical Dictionary, and I said, that is the only word in the dictionary that has Seventh-day Adventists tied to its name, its definition. And I asked some of the doctors, what is a sanitarium? They said, well, it's an old, outdated concept, and it's dead now. I said, it can't be dead. It's got our name attached to it. It must be revived. It may be sick, but it must come back to life. And so it's in contrast with sanatorium or sanatoria, which is a hospital for the treatment of chronic diseases like tuberculosis. Weimar was a sanatoria. And they bought it, refurbished it in California there, just east of Sacramento, and it's now a pace-setting institution for treatment. So Kellogg was very a popular speaker. He was famous. He used all these different kinds of treatment modalities, and he was a great lecturer. People loved him. Short little man that stood on a platform whenever he spoke because he was self-conscious about being short. And here's some of their therapy. They used the same bathtub measures for sedative baths. They used other types of immersion tubs, always with a therapist in attendance and students that were learning. And the other thing I noticed in all the pictures about Battle Creek is that the men were treating the men and the women were treating the women. Kellogg was very good about that. One time, even his patients came to him and said, you know, Dr. Kellogg, we'd like a little more entertainment here. How about a dance? And he said, great idea. The men go over in this room and you can have your dance, and the ladies will go over here and have their dance. Killed the idea right there because that's not what they had in mind. He was very sharp on his toes. And I have his book called Rational Hydrotherapy, which is about that thick. The biggest book ever written on hydrotherapy was written by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And he had a pool, very well patronized pool, not the Pool of Siloam, but a pool where back in the days before the modern bathing attire, they were well covered when they were in the water as well as out of the water. And it was very much an up and up reputable place. Then they rebuilt after the fire and rebuilt this new building. And this was his team. That's a pretty good team to run a sanitarium, wouldn't you say? A whole crowd of nurses and physicians and therapists and students and doctors. not everybody in town. That's his team that ran the Battle Creek Sanitarium. The best in the world. That's our Adventist heritage. And a doctor came there and studied with them in the 1890s and learned how to do it. And he went and did it in Europe. I'll come to that next. But Kellogg, he would have loved Twitter. He was so good with one sentence and one-liners that he would have just been putting out a tweet a day, I think, until they shut him down, like they did some other popular Twitter users. He said, "A man that lives on pork, fine flour bread, rich pies and cakes and condiments, drinks tea and coffee, and uses tobacco might as well try to fly as to be chaste in thought." In other words, you can't do it if your diet's poor. He said, "A dead cow or sheep lying in a pasture is recognized as carrion. The same sort of a carcass dressed and hung up in a butcher's stall passes as food." He had a sense of humor that they didn't always appreciate in the meat industry. And now the doctor that went over to Denmark, this is the picture at the water in Copenhagen, that doctor was Dr. Ottesen. And he went to Battle Creek, he learned how to do it, he came to Sweden and formed the Skotsborg Sanitarium. And places all over the world were started as spin-offs from Battle Creek. Australia, England. I mentioned the one in England that I visited. But this was greatly influenced by Kellogg's work. I met a man in New York City when we had the vegetarian restaurant there near Wall Street. It was actually a block from the World Trade Towers. And about 600 to 800 people coming in every day at lunch, which is quite a cooking job if you're the cook. And an old man walked in, came regular for lunch after that, Mr. Moore. And his office was number 1 Wall Street, on the ground floor. And here he was up in his upper 80s, and he came and sat at his desk every day. I don't know what he did, but in the past he'd done a lot, because he had still a prestigious office. And he became a regular customer. And he told me personally that he had been a patient of Dr. Kellogg's. And Dr. Kellogg told him how to take care of his digestive tract and what to eat and how to clean himself. And he'd been doing it for 30 years, just like Dr. Kellogg said. I thought, fascinating man. He got interested in our Adventist team and came out to the farm we had in New Jersey. And on the weekend, we'd invite several guests out there, and I, on many times, gave a little Sabbath afternoon talk to the group, and others did too. And Mr. Moore became a regular out there, but his family got concerned because he was getting so interested in Adventists, and they wanted to be sure nobody got into his pocketbook and his estate, because it was obvious that he was a very wealthy man, even though he didn't flaunt his wealth or say anything about it. And so, sad to say, one day he just disappeared. And we never did know where he went or what happened to him. But somebody had intervened in his life and made sure that he didn't get deeper with the Adventist folks. We were very disappointed about that. So now I want to help you understand some modern research about hydrotherapy. You see the point of this. That may not work forever, but I knew a man who had a whole tote full of bills that he had never opened for several years. Needless to say, some of them were from the IRS, and they came to harass him, and the lady he was married to told me about it. She was very distressed about finding that discovery. Now, I want to just take a few minutes to share about heat shock proteins. These are specific proteins that are made when cells are briefly exposed to temperatures above their normal growth temperature. What's our normal temperature? You all know. 98.6 is what everybody says. Quite often when we take a temperature with one of those little thermometer guns, it'll be 97, 97 and a half, because that's skin temperature. It's a little cooler than your core temperature. But those are your normal growth temperatures. And these heat shock proteins work when the body temperature gets in the upper 99s, a little over 100, 101, around in there. And they're a group of stress-induced proteins that protect essential cell components from various types of harmful damage. These proteins have been remarkably conserved in almost every living cell, and they just discovered them. The name derives from their production in Drosophila, which is the fruit fly. That's the botanical name for the fruit fly, following elevations in temperature. Heat shock proteins are present in the cytosol, or the cytoplasm, the watery part of the cell, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the nucleus of the cell. So they're finding it all through the cell. And I don't know why the research on COVID isn't focusing on heat shock proteins rather than vaccines, except there may not be money in this, like there is in producing a little bottle and a shot every year for the rest of your life. So the stress-inducible heat shock proteins are expressed not only in response to elevation in temperature, but also non-thermal insults, like stress. They're induced by stress to protect the organism, namely your body, from even more severe stress. Would you like to know a little bit more about this? I got some pictures to diagram and show you. So we're talking about temperature increase that's non-lethal. It's under 105, 104, but it's above the physiologic norm. And it suppresses protein synthesis and activates the heat shock factor and enhances transcription of heat shock genes, while exposure to lethal temperature, such as 108 or 109 or 110, initiates cell death, programmed cell death called apoptosis. And these heat shock proteins inhibit this reaction and give the cell thermal stability. If stress recurs, so they have other proteins called chaperones that prevent irreversible collection of unfolded proteins. Here's how it works. Let me illustrate simply. If you take an egg and you crack the egg into a bowl, what will be in the bowl? The yolk and a liquidy, kind of a thick liquidy gel called the egg white, right? You all know about an egg. And then if you take that egg before you crack it and you put it in water and boil it for 3 minutes, then you crack it open, what will it look like? It'll be a hard-boiled egg. And the egg yolk will be the same color, and the egg white will be what I just gave it away, didn't I? It turns white. And it's rubbery instead of gel, liquid gel. And what has happened is the protein of the egg, which is the egg white, has been denatured or changed in chemistry so that the three-dimensional structure of each protein molecule, which is twisted and folded in a certain way, is stretched out, and it loses its structure, and it's called a denatured protein, which you can eat if you eat egg white, and you digest the protein about the same, only you've cooked it, and most people would rather cook the egg than eat it raw for other reasons. And so the heat shock proteins inhibit the denaturing of a protein, and they will protect that protein. in your body. Here's a diagram. If you take the protein normally folded and you heat it, then it unfolds and it gets an erratic or irregular shape that's worthless for the enzyme action of that protein. And the heat shock proteins, there's about 90 some different ones that have been identified. They work on this, whoops, I hit something wrong. They work on the protein and they refold it back into its previous folded way. Like if you had a bunch of church bulletins and you threw them out and they all came apart, you'd have to gather them up and fold them back together again. So when the protein is folded appropriately, it works as an enzyme. When it's unfolded, it's only useful for amino acids to be broken down for energy. And then if it's overheated too much so it can't be repaired, it's degraded and it's eaten by other cells of the body and broken back into amino acids or degraded by enzymes called proteasomes. So what the purpose of these heat shock proteins is to refold the protein so that it works again. And these proteins are antibodies that are fighting viruses and cancer cells, which is why heating the body works. And we didn't know this. We knew that hydrotherapy worked, but we didn't know how. Isn't that amazing? So it wasn't that God just learned something. Human researchers learned something. And when I shared this at Weimar, the doctors there and the therapists were so excited with this information, they went back to their hydrotherapy departments with renewed vigor and enthusiasm and information, and they're treating people very successfully there. So they're regulated in a way. Here we have thermal stress, which is heating. We have it unfolding the protein, and here's heat shock protein number 90 and number 70 and number 40. There's almost 100 of these, and only recently discovered. And they get back into an enzyme cascade here where they work to reform the protein into a normal folded type again that will do its good. And to gather them up, if the wind blows and the leaves are all scattered, you have to gather them back up before you can do something with them. We call these chaperone proteins. And these chaperone gather the damaged proteins and the heat shock proteins, and they gather them up together and they take them to a special part of the cell where they can put them back to normal again. I think this is fascinating, that God designed this all into man 6,000 years ago, and we're just now discovering how it works. So that you take stress, not just heat, like a fever, and people with COVID, they get a fever, and sometimes under stress we just feel like we're losing our energies and losing our strength, and the proteins in our body are changing and getting into a different three-dimensional structure. They're detected by the body. They're gathered together by these chaperones, and with the help of RNA, not messenger RNA that's in the vaccine, but the RNA in your own cells that's been there from your birth, puts it back together and refolds it and puts it back into normal shape where it can be active again. And the mild heat accomplishes it, whereas extremes of heat will hurt it. And no heat doesn't do anything to it. So sometimes you feel like, well, I've lost my energy, so I'll just lay around. No, do something. Get in the shower, take a hot shower, cold contrast, take a hot bath. Do something. Take some water internally. Get some vitamins and some herbal teas, and get your protein structure put back to normal. And So it works in the brain too, to get your brain going again. They found heat shock proteins in the pancreas, the liver, the intestinal structures, the muscles, and even in the brain. And so in the brain, the denatured proteins again mean you're getting forgetful, you're getting tired, you're getting neglectful, you're getting depressed. And with the help of hydrotherapy, along with maybe walking out in nature, drinking more water, and eating a healthful diet, the body heals itself. That's how Dr. Kellogg was able to write a book called The Cure of the Incurables, and why people flock to him from all over the world, including President Howard Taft, who was one of our presidents. I don't remember which number, but they had to build a special bathtub for him since he weighed about 350 pounds, and he'd gotten stuck in his tub at the White House, and so they ended up building a bigger one for him. But he came to Battle Creek, and guess what they put him on? A diet. And he lost weight, and he probably extended his life. So these heat shock proteins that act as chaperones unite here, and these are not the things they're so afraid of with the vaccine, but these are natural things that are in your body that go into the cell and help them come out with a healthy protein again. And I won't go into the complexity of that, but you can see how scientists are designing models to understand it better. So here's how the chaperones work, to make it simple. They prevent both newly synthesized polypeptide chains and assembled units from aggregating into non-functional structures, high temperatures and other stresses such as altered pH and oxygen deprivation. Does that ring a bell with COVID? Oxygen deprivation? Make it more difficult for proteins to form their proper structures and cause some already structured proteins to unfold. These heat shock proteins are induced rapidly at high levels to deal with this problem, which is why when you get a virus, you run a fever. And if you can't run a fever, you don't get well as quickly. Children, for example, with chicken pox, nearly always have a fever. And when I was a little boy, and one child in the area, maybe it would be Sabbath school or in the neighborhood, had chicken pox, what would the parents do?
Get them all together.
Gather the kids together, have a little social gathering, expose them all to one another. Today we call that herd immunity. But they would gather them all together. Sure enough, most of the kids got chicken pox. A few itchy spots on their skin and a low-grade fever for a few days. They were getting immunity. And then later in life, those that didn't get chicken pox in childhood or maybe had a vaccine instead that gave only short-term immunity, they got a disease called shingles in their 50s, 60s, 70s, often right after major stress. One lady I know, her son insulted her and treated her mean. She came right down with shingles. She got hurt so bad emotionally that she got shingles, and pretty soon she's got this painful rash on her arm, I think it was. And so what we recommended was some fever therapy for her, because the people with shingles didn't get the fever like the chickens with the children with chicken pox got the fever. And it's the same virus. You see. Thank you for your patience with me when I make a slip of the tongue. I'm glad it makes you smile. It does me too. So this is how these proteins work. They gather up the damaged particles and they reassemble them and put them back in shape. So, summary, and then I'm going to take a question or two, or 3 or 4. What happened to the vision for our sanitariums? One is hydrotherapy takes more time. It may be less remunerative. drug prescribing is easier, just pop a pill. People are looking for quick cures without necessity for change. It's time for us to educate them and to reestablish teams in every church and every community that know enough about hydrotherapy to go to a home or to have what we called in the old days treatment rooms in connection with the churches. And our mission is to show the advantages of using natural remedies, to learn how to utilize hydrotherapy with skill and wisdom, to publish data, that's what I tell my scientist friends, and to give the glory where it belongs to God for the ideas, the skill, and the healing. Do you think God gets more glory when we do things His way than when we just try the... So our approach to this latest virus and the more viruses that are coming down the pike is not to just be against everything medical that's being done or to fight against the virus or the vaccine, but to have something better. Ellen White says something better is the watchword of all true living. And to me, as a physician, hydrotherapy is that something better that God has given us.